Sometimes your characters need to find a magical pillar in the woods, and naturally you want that to light up. That's what we're doing this week. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Garmin. This, of course, is the Storycraft Society, and this week my players are going to be exploring a haunted section of woods. What are they going to find in that haunted section of woods? They're going to find a pillar that is not activated, that should be activated, and what is going to happen when that pillar activates is the guardian protector that kind of protected this whole section of woods is going to come back online to life, whatever you want to call it. So, of course, that meant that I needed, I wanted a special set of pillars that will, go along with this scene and adventure. So I wanted to make what I saw in my head when I made these pillars. And specifically, that was a shape that started skinny at the top, came and got a little wider, went back to being skinny, and then sat on a base. And of course, I wanted them to light up. This week was fun because it was, I didn't necessarily have a plan, but I did have a vision, and getting to execute that was really, really rewarding. So, have a look. I started with cheap tea lights that I got from Walmart. These are so inexpensive. They're like 50 cents a piece or something. I'm sure you could buy nicer ones somewhere else, but this is certainly all I need for my crafting. The next thing that I did was I pulled out some heavyweight chipboard. Now, heavyweight chipboard is basically the same thing as what you get out of the back of a spiral notebook, except that's a lighter weight chipboard. This is the really, really heavy stuff. It is almost like a particle board or like a masonite. So I took that and I traced the outline of the tea light onto the heavyweight chipboard. That way I know exactly where they are going to fit up on top. And then I used a Sharpie to draw out just a general shape of what I wanted the outside of my bases to look like. I didn't want them to be a perfect circle because that always looks a little bit unnatural on the game table. So I make curvy and wavy lines in order to make it look just, a little bit less like rigid, sharp lines. The next step that I took was to cut out the bases. Now, I will say this was challenging. I used a craft knife to shape out the outside of the base. I just went along where the Sharpie lines were and went nice and slow and easy and just carved away until I got the bases looking around the outside the way that I wanted them to look. Now, that's not the hard part. The hard part is coming. I will be getting to that in a second, but I did need to clean up all the little scraps, so just a little quick and I got all of the scraps. And I got all of the scraps all cleaned up. Moving on. So with the base all cut out around the outside, it was time to carve out the area where the tea light went. And I will be honest, this part sucked. It was not fun. It was definitely something that felt dangerous the whole way through. And using a Dremel to do this job would have been much safer and easier. You live and you learn. I'll do it that way next time. But with my Alpha knife, I went around this circle over and over and over and over again. If you tried to rush, that's where it started to feel crazy dangerous. And if you went super slow, that's where I got impatient and it just took me a while. This is one of those things where I'm glad that I went slow, but it just took forever and was a pretty frustrating part of the process. And hey, I got it done, and I didn't lose any fingers in the process. Actually, that's not funny at all. This seriously was a pretty dangerous bit, and messing around with blades, don't do that. Not a good idea, because that would really suck. Anyway, moving on. So to attach the tea light to the base, I broke out my super glue and baking soda. Now this is a really neat trick that I've used in a couple of other videos, but I can explain it really fast, so I'm gonna do it right now. Super glue, for whatever reason, when it is touched with baking soda, immediately dries. I don't understand the science of it or the chemistry of it or whatever. I just know that it works, and you end up with this really cool, interesting, almost like sandy texture over the top of the super glue. And this actually works even when the super glue is pretty deep. I mean, it doesn't work when it's super deep, but it does work so you can actually make little mounds and stuff with it. But anyway, that's not what I'm doing in this video. So what I did was I took my tea light and I ran super glue the whole way around its base. I sat it into place in the base of chipboard that I made. And then with that done, I dropped baking soda all over the base, tapped it in with my finger to make sure that it got into all of the little nooks and crannies. And then that just locked my tea light into the base. Now I will say this is not the most permanent solution. This little amount of super glue is not going to really hold it up, but we're going to be doing things later to really lock it all tightly into place. But we'll get to that in a minute. For the next bit, I was going to need a sheet of plastic. So what I did was I pulled out a deep cuts box and I just pulled the plastic out of that. Now, I have no idea where you could buy this plastic sheeting if you wanted to buy it somewhere like in a store, because I've honestly just never had the need for it. I find being in this hobby, I have so many boxes, like miniatures boxes or tool boxes or little bits of terrain or something that you buy that has this plastic sheeting in it. So I've never felt the need to buy it. I just kind of upcycle it from somewhere else in one of my hobby boxes or something. That was a long explanation for what could have been a lot more simple. But I pulled that out, set that off to the side, and then to get my vision all out, I made a paper template. That was important to me because the paper template allowed me to guarantee that what was going to go onto my foam was what I saw in my head, and it also would take out all of the guesswork in making sure that all of my pieces of foam end up being the same. So I just used a general idea of what I saw in my head and a ruler to mark out the general shape of it, and then I cut that out and used it to mark all of my foam. I decided to use foam core here for one major reason, and that's because it already is thin enough. I wanted that about 3/16 thick piece of foam, and the foam core was already that. I used an alpha knife to cut out the foam core. I needed 8 of these since I was going to be making 2 pillars. So with that done, I realized I had kind of finished the easy part of this project, and I started to get into the more challenging stuff. In my head, these magical arcane pillars had cool symbols all over them, and I wanted those symbols to be able to glow. That's going to be the tea light down underneath, and it would kind of glow up into the pillar and then glow out of these symbols. So I started by sharpening out an idea onto my foam core. This was something that I just kind of free-handed it and hoped that it looked cool. You can get inspiration for this kind of stuff from all kinds of places. For me, I just had an idea of what I saw in my head, so I went ahead and marked that down. And then I used a hot knife to cut those out. I'm sure you could use an alpha knife or a craft knife to do it if you wanted, just go slow and a little more careful. But I was done with the slow and careful with the blade, so I just used the hot knife to get it done quick and easy. Then one of the smartest ideas I've ever had, maybe on any build that I've ever done, is I blacked out the inside of the symbols in this step because I wasn't interested in having to paint them later. And boy, am I glad that I did this, because if I wouldn't have done this, it would have added a ton of extra time onto this project. This was like pretty high level smart brain Garmin. He comes out every once in a while. And then lastly, I painted the insides of the foam all in a metallic silver. My idea for this is that it would be reflective, so when my tea light that's not super powerful is down inside of the pillar, it would kind of magnify the light and make it brighter when it comes out of the symbols. With Eileen's tacky glue in hand, I set into gluing all of the foam down onto the plastic sheet. Now you'll notice that I just glued it straight down to the sheet. That's on purpose because I knew that later I could use the foam as the template to cut out the plastic and it would make a perfect shape. So I didn't have to worry about cutting the foam out, then cutting the plastic sheeting out, and then making sure that they matched up perfect. I could just do that once the PVA glue was dry. Speaking of dry time, I had to let the PVA glue dry, so I set that off to the side. I put some books on top of it to dry, and then I moved on to working on the base. So with our little pieces glued here, now it's time for me to figure out what I'm going to be doing for the surfaces. And so I have the bricks that I have left over from the bridge and Banks episode, as well as this tub of bricks that I'm not actually sure where they came from. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to pull these out. These are like kind of long and thin, and I'm gonna run those down along these edges like that to do like a vertical thing. And then I will take these and run those across the surface here to be like my regular old bricks. I think that's the plan. All right, let's go. So this section was not so bad. I took my longer bricks and I cut a V into them using my alpha knife, and then I just glued them onto the corner of my foam substructure. Then in between those, I glued my rectangular bricks across the faces. It ended up making 2 rows, and then up top, I let them run wild and just cut them off to make them perfectly even. Lastly, I added some decorative stones up on top. That way it just filled out the top of the base and made it look like it deserves a magical pillar setting on top of it. But I used hot glue on that whole entire section, so that got done really quickly. So let's head back over to the faces. At this point, the PVA had mostly dried, and that allowed me to start cutting them out. So I pulled out a set of just hand scissors and started to cut the shapes out using the foam as a template. And this worked great. It allowed me to have the plastic be perfectly in line with the foam and no extra fuss needed. To get the faces to look like stone, I pulled out a tinfoil ball and textured all over that. And there's something special about the way that foam core takes texture that a lot of XPS foam doesn't. I don't know, that could just be something that I'm imagining, but I tell you, every time I use this tinfoil ball trick on foam core, it just feels like it takes the texture so well. But anyway, the real challenge starts here, and I will let myself from the past explain a little bit of that. So the next part of this build is definitely going to get a little bit confusing because honestly, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of winging it and hoping that I get the right thing to happen. So I made all of these pieces and I've gotten them textured up and all that stuff. Now what I need to do is find the way to get them to go together to make the pillar, right? So I made this little jig. Jig is a real loose term because it's just two pieces of foam core, one that's glued down to the table and then one that's glued in a way that I can set my vertical piece in and then set my horizontal piece down so that you can end up putting hot glue in there. That's the first thing I did to make this easier on myself. The second thing is I have to get these pieces ready, and the way that I'm going to do that is by cutting horizontally across the front of them. That will let them bend, and then scoring the plastic on the back to allow that to bend. So once I have that done, then I'm going to take and start putting hot glue in between, letting it cool all the way, and then hopefully that works. We'll see. We'll see. The great news here is that this went really well. I mean, a lot better than a lot of my guesses end up going. All I can say is I love it when a plan comes together. I will say that gluing the pieces together, that was absolutely the hardest part of this process. Particularly when I got to the part where I was gluing face 4 to 1, 2, and 3 that were already glued together. That got really challenging in super tight spaces, having to stick the nozzle of the glue gun way down in and kind of squeezing and hoping that the glue fell into the right place using gravity. That was definitely a challenge, but that certainly did turn out. One little trick that I figured out during this process was to put a glob of glue on the bottom and a glob of glue on the top. Let those harden, and then now that you've already got that joint kind of stable, then go in and fill the rest of it in to really lock it in place. That seemed to work a little bit better, particularly for these really tight areas where you're sticking the nozzle way in. So when it was done, it looked like this, and now it was time to move on to the little bottom pieces, because you have the upper parts like this, and then the bottoms have to get pulled in also. This was actually a little bit more challenging than the top, because the bottoms had that like spring back effect to them. It was definitely tighter because it made the area even smaller, but again, with patience and going slow and using my jig, I was able to get these all glued together as well. And it looked like this. Needless to say, I was getting pretty hyped at this point. For the trim on the pillars, I pulled out my XPS foam and I cut it into 1/4 inch strips. I textured it up to look like stone using a tinfoil ball, and then I glued that into place. Now the way that I did that was I started at the bottom of my pillars and I used hot glue to glue it in place, letting the top kind of stick out the direction that it was pointing. Once the hot glue dried, then I took and bent it into place, being careful not to snap the foam, and then I just put hot glue in the upper part and pushed it down in to tack it down into place. This worked really well, and it added a cohesion to the piece so that from the top to the bottom, it looked like there was a unifying structure. Once I had all 4 pieces on, you can notice that I let them run long. That was on purpose because it's way easier to just cut them off flush at the top than to waste time trying to measure them out and hope that you get it right. That's just a little tip that makes your life so much easier. The final thing that I did for the pillars is I made made a cap for on top. I just used a little piece of foam and cut it a little bit larger than the rest of it, textured it up with a tinfoil ball, and then hot glued it in place. I'm still shocked at this stage at how good they looked, and they were exactly what I saw in my mind. Now for versatility, I did make the trim on my second piece look like wood. By the time it gets to the table, this gives me some options, and having options is always great, but now I've got a wood trimmed pillar that looks maybe a little bit more natural, and then a stone pillar that could be a little bit more dungeony. I don't know yet, but I figure having the options will be neat. The final thing that I did was I glued the pillars down onto the bases, and this thing was basically done. Certainly all of the challenge was finished, and I only had a couple of small steps left. The first thing I did was use PVA glue to glue sand down onto the bases. That gives them a little bit of ground texture. The next thing that I did was I used Blackmagic Craft base coat over the whole thing. For those who don't know, that is a 50-50 mixture of black acrylic craft paint and matte Mod Podge, and what that does is it just seals the whole piece together and locks it all up, plus it gives you a black undercoat to move on to your painting step, which is exactly what I did. I just used my typical paint scheme, nothing special here, but I did go a little bit above and beyond on these pieces because I was so excited and I based them, and that's what got me feeling that I really did something special for my table this week. I really find that pieces that give me a little bit of anxiety while I'm working on them end up somehow turning out the best. I just feel like I've got a little bit more unnecessary but helpful pressure to make the vision in my head come to the table, and that certainly is what happened with these magic pillars. I don't make stuff with lights a lot. That's really neat, and I'm glad that that's something that I could incorporate into this build. And I also don't end up using a lot of like multi-surface, I've got the plastic and the foam and the lights and all that stuff. So the fact that it all came together for me just felt that much better. I hope that you enjoyed watching this as much as I did making it, and if you did, please leave me a like down below. Leave me a comment of what you think of the project, of a project that you'd like to see me do in the future, or just say hello. That goes a long way as well. If you're subscribed to the channel, that's awesome. If you're not, you should consider subscribing because it costs you absolutely nothing, and you can always unsubscribe if you don't enjoy the content, but I promise you, you will enjoy the content. At least I hope so. And then also, if you know a friend who would enjoy this content, definitely share this with them. That is the number one way that you can help a small YouTube channel, is to share these videos so that other people can see the videos. That's like the whole thing. So, whew. If you enjoyed, nope, already did that part. That's all I have for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Until next week, I'll be seeing you. I got a new mic. I think it sounds way better.
I hope it sounds real better. That's not English. Whoops.